righty, I have the signal to go ahead. Thanks everybody for stopping everything on your Saturday afternoon and coming by to join us for this talk. My name is Christine Brown. I am Outreach and Interpretation Historian with the Montana Historical Society. And I am really excited today to introduce this talk. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I had the pleasure of working on the book we put out a few years ago, The Hand Raised the Barns of Montana. And in researching the many different kinds of barns in Montana, I touched on a few horse barns and was very captivated, but wasn't able to do the full research I would like to do. So this is where our talk today by Brenda Wahler comes in. And we are going to learn all about the horse Spokane today. Montana's biggest news story of 1889 was not statehood. It was the Kentucky Derby triumph of Montana-raised Thoroughbred horse Spokane. Foaled in Twin Bridges, subject of 19th century media feeding frenzy at the time of his win, surviving tragedy and ending in mystery, the chestnut colt has captivated generations of Montanas. Brenda Wahler is a Helena attorney, a former history teacher, a lifelong horsewoman, and she spent a year researching the history of the racing circuit in Montana. And this summer, in July, her book is coming out, Montana Horse Racing, A History. Look for it. And you don't even have to look for it. She has actually brought pre-order forms today, too, if you would like to get on the list. So those are over on the table, and can work on that at the end of her talk. A few housekeeping things. Brenda will take questions at the end of her presentation, and she has also brought some wonderful artifacts from the horse racing world, and we just want to remind everyone that those are for looking at. We just ask that we don't touch them. So without further chatting, I introduce Brenda Wahler. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. And I'll give you a little bit of background on these artifacts that are sitting over here on the next to the stage. These are, except for the boots are mine, everything else is from the collection at the Montana Historical Society. The jockey track silks and breeches, cap, and the saddle blanket came from the Western Montana Turf Club over in Missoula. And when they shut down that track, they donated some of the things they had to the society to be preserved. The saddle itself has been part of the museum's collection. The date on it is 1923. I suspect that saddle is quite a bit older. It's a lot like the old style racing saddles that would have been used in Spokane's time. If anybody is familiar with horse racing, they look a lot different today, but you used to hear the old timers talk about a pancake saddle, and that was the pancake saddle. So that's what we brought out for folks to take a look at. We already gave you the biggest spoiler. We've got a horse named Spokane, and he won this really big race. And I wish I could keep the suspense going, whether he was going to win or not, but we kind of know he did. So with that, this is probably the best image of Spokane that's out there. There are no photographs of him that were taken, so we just have to rely on artists' representations. But this is, I believe this image is the one they use in the Kentucky Derby Museum to show what he looked like. Chestnut horse, that means he was kind of a rust brown color all over with two white hind legs, and then the blaze down his face was kind of a distinctive, sort of a triangle that ended above his nose. And so when we're looking for things that look like Spokane, when we get to the end of the talk, we'll have some fun. Those markings are going to be important. His story begins with a man named Noah Armstrong, who was a Canadian-born chemist, engineer, pharmacist, very well-educated man, came out to Montana about 1863, did a lot of he staked a lot of prospecting claims, traveled heavily. Most of his family stayed back in Minnesota. His wife, Hannah, they had 4 children. 1 died young, and the other 3 lived to adulthood. His most profitable mining claim was the Hecla Lode, and that was over in the Pioneer Mountains. And in 1873, he brought his whole family out. His children were almost grown. He was 50 years old, and they all settled in Glendale, Montana, which is sort of west of Interstate 15, more or less in the vicinity of Melrose, a bit in the general vicinity of Dillon. It's quite a ways from Dillon, but you can actually go off the interstate, go through Melrose, and search for it in Google Earth and find a few remnants of the town. In 1875, he built a smelter along with some business partners, and by 1877, they went back to Indiana and incorporated as the Hecla Consolidated Mining Company. And yes, same company that's around today. He made a significant fortune smelting silver ore. Glendale, a couple of pictures of it in its prime. It was a thriving boom town. It was all pretty much built along one very long street. And what are you going to do if you have one very long street? You are going to hold horse races every Sunday. And you are going to be running those horses, and you're going to have betting, and you're going to be having a great time. Armstrong was a part of that whole scene. He managed the Hecla Company until 1879. But tragedy struck his family in 1883. A diphtheria epidemic swept through the town. His children had married and had children of their own. 3 of his grandchildren died in that epidemic. 2 years later, his wife Hannah died. And in that period of time, he was sort of saying goodbye to Glendale. He'd moved over to Twin Bridges. He'd bought land. He actually, when he signed himself up as a member of the Montana Pioneers, he described himself as a resident of Twin Bridges. And as he stepped out of working with Hecla Mining, he started investing in railroads, especially some of the railroads going through Washington State, and racehorses. I touched briefly on the rest of the story of Glendale. It was thriving until about the Panic of 1893 and the collapse of the silver market, at which point in time it slowly declined, and now there might be a couple buildings left. It's a ghost town. What do you do when you have a large fortune? There's a saying, how do you make a small fortune with racehorses? Start with a large one. And so this is what Armstrong did. As he began to invest his large fortune in his horse ranch. This is the Doncaster round barn. I took this photo last summer. This was his pride and joy. This was the horse barn he built in Twin Bridges. He started out by buying a small ranch that his son and daughter owned, or daughter-in-law, I should say. His son Charles, who unfortunately a lot of the myths about the Doncaster Ranch and the round barn came from Charles. Charles claimed that the barn door was so large that you could haul, a wagon pulled by 10 horses would fit in there. He claimed that the indoor corridor was a 1/4 mile long. Charles was a very nice man, very loyal to his dad, but he had a tendency to inflate everything by a factor of 10. But this round barn was a thing that was being promoted by the agricultural colleges in its time as wind resistant, weather resistant, and requiring less internal support, so it was considered to be a very stable architectural design. We also today have Spokane still running through the fields of the Jefferson River Valley in the form of a brand new, what's the word I'm looking for the weather vane on top of the barn. Originally, there was actually a windmill on the top of this barn that was used to pump water. There was a well pipe that ran clear down, pumped water up into a cistern that was on this 3rd floor, and then the water was piped from the 3rd floor back down to the 1st floor, and each of these doors that you see were a box stall for a horse. Each horse had his own window, he had his own door, and he would have a little pen and could go in and out as he or she chose. Then the 2nd floor was all devoted to feed storage, hay, grain, whatever else they needed. The interior, this is what it looks like today. They've done some extensive renovations. This is now an event center. They can have weddings, they can have dances, they can do all sorts of things. but you can still see each of these pillars. These were where the stalls were. And again, you can see the doors, you can see the windows, and then these slanty things up here by each stall, Charles Armstrong called them an automatic conveyance. We would also just call them a feed chute, but they could take the hay and the grain from the top floor and just shove it down into each horse's stall, and so one guy could just come up there and feed all the horses. In the middle was this quarters about 20 feet wide, and back in the day it was dirt. And in the winter, it's about the, again, it's not a quarter mile long, even though that was what Charles claimed it was. It is about the size, if anybody's a horse person familiar with a round pen, it's about the size of a 70-foot round pen. And so you could kick horses into this and let them run around and exercise in there, and it was a good way to leg them up. Some people claimed they could ride a horse in here. I've been in there. I would say those beams, would not want to be riding a horse with the ceiling that low. But you never know. I suppose in theory, if you really crouched down, you could make it happen. But so this was the interior of the barn. What I found was just amazing. I was basically trying to debunk the idea that that track was a quarter mile long, so I was using Google Earth to measure the circumference of the barn and calculate the length of the quarter with using some pi and some other formulas. And look what I saw. When I pulled that video or that aerial photo, that track measures, it's a half-mile oval. It was Armstrong's training track. It was probably put in about 1882, 1883, somewhere there. And so it's been a cow pasture for well over 100 years, and yet you can still see that oval footprint to show that once upon a time there was a racetrack there to condition his horses. Now, a lot of myth busting. Whenever you talk about Spokane, there's so many tall tales. I don't even know where to begin, but two of the big ones was, why did he name this place the Doncaster Ranch? And you have a lot of people saying, well, it was his favorite horse. Well, he never owned a horse named Doncaster. Some people say, well, it was his famous trotting horse. Well, there's a famous trotting horse, we're going to talk about him, and his name was Doncaster, but he wasn't the horse they named the barn after. There is a real Doncaster, and this is a famous race course in England. It is the home of one of their English Triple Crown races called the St. Leger. That race first ran in 1776. This image is from about 1851. This is what it looked like at the time. This is Doncaster Racecourse today. They're still running horses. I mean, beautiful turf tracks. They run the opposite direction from us now. We go run fast, turn left. They go run fast, turn right over in the UK. But so Armstrong, he knew horses. He doesn't talk about it a lot, but you can tell by the way just the things he quietly did, he knew about this race course. And he also knew about this is the famous racehorse that was named after named in honor of the Doncaster track, and its name was Doncaster. And in 1873, and this would have been the year that Noah Armstrong moved his family to Montana, this horse wins what my British friends call the Derby, and we in the U.S. call it the Epsom Derby. So he was a major champion. He went on to sire horses that in turn won the Epsom Derby. Very, very famous racehorse. There was also a trotting horse. And this trotting horse was owned by a fellow in the Twin Bridges area over in the Ruby Valley, had a ranch on Sweetwater Creek. His name was William Hillhouse Raymond. And in 1876, Raymond went back to Kentucky and bought a number of very fine quality, what we now today would call standard breds, trotting horses. His pride and joy was a horse named Commodore Belmont, and this was a picture from Leeson's History of Montana. He named his farm Belmont Park in honor of his favorite horse. And this is where some of the confusion, it's like, yes, there was a guy in Madison County who did name his farm after his favorite horse, but it was Raymond. And unfortunately, there's a lot of bad horse art out there. This horse does not look like a champion trotting horse, even though he was. You see they've got some trotting horses in the background showing how he did harness racing over there at the Raymond Ranch. The other reason that Raymond is famous in the horse world is this little guy in the back, his name is Tom Thumb. Raymond brought the first Shetland ponies to Montana. And I don't know about you, but I was issued a Shetland pony when I was about 8 years old, and they told me that if the pony did not kill me and I did not kill the pony, I might earn my way to a big horse. And I did, but, you know, curses, W.H. Raymond, curses, curses. His famous horse, Commodore Belmont, sired a trotter that Raymond named Doncaster. But the foal, he was born in 1880. He didn't hit the track and start winning until 1883. Armstrong already built Doncaster Ranch. He wasn't going to be naming his ranch after his competition's 2-year-old. It's not going to happen. Doncaster, the trotter, was kind of interesting because he later sold to Marcus Daly. Marcus Daly renamed him Delgamo. So that's the story of Montana's trotting horse named Doncaster. Now, Noah Armstrong, Spokane was not the only good horse he owned. He had a number of racehorses he kept back east. His most famous prior to Spokane was Lord Ragland, who ran third in the Kentucky Derby in 1883. In 1884, Armstrong purchased a horse named Tom Bowling. People named horses with human names back then. It gets real confusing, but the horse was named Tom Bowling. He was an older horse by that time, but he brought him out to Montana to breed more thoroughbreds, and he also crossed him on some local mares. The other horse that Armstrong had purchased, he got him as a yearling in 1883, was a horse named Gray Cloud. Gray Cloud he got from a gentleman who was named General Richard Rowett. He was in Illinois. Bought the colt as a yearling, did the responsible horse owner thing and gilded him. And then this brilliant gilding becomes a major stakes winner. So what do you say when you've gilded a winning racehorse besides whoops? You are also going to take a look at who's his daddy and who's his mommy, and you wonder, can we make lightning strike twice? So this brings us to Spokane. And Spokane, Armstrong, he's got Gray Cloud. Gray Cloud's doing really well. He goes back to General Rowett's farm and says, let's take a look around the stable and see what we have. And lo and behold, Gray Cloud's mama interposes for sale. Not only that, she's for sale. She's an older mare by this time. She's got a filly at side, and she's pregnant. So he pays $1,000 for basically a 3-in-1 package. And the horse she's in foal to is Gray Cloud's sire, Hyder Alley. He puts this pregnant mare and her suckling foal on a train, brings her out to Montana, and the following spring, there's a little chestnut colt born in the Round Barn in Twin Bridges, Montana. And he grows up to be a pretty average-sized racehorse, pretty little guy, and we name him Spokane. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. When Spokane was foaled, Armstrong traveled all over the place with his railroad interests, and he was in the city of Spokane Falls, Washington Territory, now Spokane, Washington, when he got word that his mare had foaled, and guess what? It was a boy. And he was delighted. He decided that he was going to name the foal Spokane. At the time, people were in Spokane heard him say, oh, this is great, I'll name him Spokane because, you guys are such great people and I'm so happy, that you've been treating me so well and this is great. At the time of his Kentucky Derby win, Armstrong expanded on the story a little bit, and you'll find that Armstrong was pretty savvy. He said that, the name of Spokane was in honor of Spokane Falls, Washington Territory, and secondly, because of an old Indian tradition of that locality that very much interested me. And that was something that took place near what today is the Spokane River Centennial Trail, which runs basically from about Post Falls, Idaho, into the city of Spokane, roughly paralleling I-90. And it's the story of this horse slaughter camp. It's quite a tragic tale. The very short version of this story goes back to Isaac Stevens, who some of you know as the former territorial governor of Washington State, Washington Territory. I should say Washington Territory, he died before it became a state. And he is the gentleman we know of as the person who negotiated the Hellgate Treaty here in Montana. He also negotiated a treaty in 1855 with the tribes of central Washington, particularly the Yakima Nation. And in 1855, he got everybody to sign a treaty, and he told them that in exchange for giving up millions and millions of acres of land so that the Mullen Road could go through, so railroads could go through and other settlement could arrive, he'd give people 2 years to relocate to their land that they'd been granted under the treaty. Probably set a record for whiplash. 12 days later, he opened the territory up to white settlement. To no surprise, the Yakima people were not happy about this, and this begins the Yakima War, which then morphs into the Coeur d'Alene War as the Spokane tribe, the Palouse people, the Coeur d'Alenes, and even the Salish begin to realize that the Mullen Road is going to go right through their land, and this is not going to be good for them. And so, by 1858, in eastern Washington, we have considerable hostilities. And what happened in September of that year is that the combined tribes had defeated the U.S. military fairly decisively in a couple of battles. And at that point, orders go out to then Colonel George Wright out of Fort Walla Walla to win decisively. And so he gathers about 700 men and a whole bunch of howitzers and heads north and does so. In the course of a couple of different battles, he defeats the tribal people. He gets them driven from the battlefield. And at one point, as they retreat, they realize their horse herd is very valuable, and especially the Palouse people, who we later have gotten the word Appaloosa horse from the Palouse tribe. They had about 1,000 horses, and they knew they had to get them out of there fast. And so they began to drive them south, but Wright's, one of his captains, Erasmus Keyes, caught up to them. They captured the whole herd, and they rounded them up and corralled them near the Spokane River, roughly where Liberty Lake, Washington is today. At that point, the tribes were, the police, they were upset, but they said, oh, they stole our horses, we'll steal them back. And their chief was named Tilcoax, and he was sort of urging a wait-and-see attitude. But unfortunately, Wright decided it was time to teach everybody a lesson. He was a scorched earth kind of guy, and he ordered the troops to shoot every one of the horses. And it was a horrible, tragic situation. This sketch says horse slaughter camp on the Spokane River, 8th, 9th, and 10th of September 1858. It took 3 days to shoot all of them. They saved back maybe 100, and then they just left them. And they left them to just rot. The carcasses, as they fell back into the earth, the boneyard was visible for over 50 years thereafter. Some people called it Wright's Boneyard. The Coeur d'Alene folks referred to it as White Lake because of the bleached bones. And what we know about Armstrong coming to visit the city of Spokane is the location of horse slaughter camp. It was impossible. Even by 1886, it was still visible. And so it's almost certain that Armstrong would have known of horse slaughter camp. From the tragedy have come some legends, and in the course of working on my book, I interviewed Susan Nardinger, who wrote Spirit Horse of the Rockies, which was a biography of Spokane, and neither she nor myself can predate this story prior to the newspapers telling it in 1889 when Spokane won the Derby. But the way the story goes is that there was a legend. And the legend was that either Chief Tilcoax or a wounded warrior on the battlefield or somebody saw the spirit of the 1,000 dead horses rise up into the sky and form into the shape of a horse dancing in the clouds. And that this horse, as we get to 1889 and the Nashville American reports on Spokane's win, they claim that a voice told this man that a spirit horse will return with the speed, endurance, and pluck of all the horses dead on the battlefield. He will enter into the body of the colt, and then, of course, you get a little bit of hyperbole. That's highly unlikely because these were the Palouse people, but said, the horse will be named Spokane and will go forth to conquer all the horses of the earth. And, of course, the reporters of the papers in 1889 declared the prophecy was fulfilled. As I say, we don't know what the original story was like, but there probably was some type of a spirit horse story. Armstrong probably heard it, and this was the old tradition of the location that interested him very much. And although he's not quoted as the source for the spirit horse story, probably that's where the story came from. So that's the tale of the true story of Spokane so far. Now, a few myths that have soaked in over the years. There's a story that Armstrong owned Hyder Alley and that Spokane was bred in Montana. No. But what was interesting is after Spokane won, again, Marcus Staley over in Butte always had an eye for a fast horse. He bought Hyder Alley in 1890 and brought him to his Bitterroot Stock Farm over in Hamilton. There's another story that interposed was really that Spokane's father was a wild Mustang and that she had escaped and ran wild for 7 years. Well, no, she was shipped east on a train pregnant in 1885, and they kept a pretty good eye on her when she got to Montana. The big one, and I actually heard the broadcasters on the NBC Derby broadcast last year repeat this story when they did a short piece on Bolt d'Oro, who was running in the Derby. There was this tale that Spokane also grew up wild on the range, and when he was a yearling, he was attacked by a mountain lion who scarred his flanks as he fled for his life and scarred him for life. Well, no, that didn't happen either. Great story, but unfortunately it did not. And last but not least is the tale that he grew up wild on the range, was a wild outlaw that took 6 men to subdue him. No, actually, this is the guy that trained him. This man is named Joe Redfern. When he was probably about a 15-year-old teenaged ranch hand, they had apparently a horse trainer that wasn't working out for them that they sent down the road, and they told him, kid, you go get on that horse. But you better be nice to him. He's going to be a racehorse. He's going to be a fine, fancy horse. We're not going to be having a lot of bad treatment here. And so Redfern gave an interview, the year before he died, he gave an interview in 1954 where he said that he thought the colt was very nice, claimed as an old man, well, the minute I sat him on, I knew I was on a champion, okay, perhaps. But he said he trained him without spur and with pancake saddle. And again, we have our pancake saddle sitting over here on the other side of the screen. That saddle is probably very similar to the saddle that Mr. Redfern used when he started Spokane under saddle. Now, Spokane leaves Montana as a 2-year-old, and in 1888, they had to take horses down to Dillon if they were going to put them on a stock car or a horse car. They were a little better quality than the cattle cars, to ship them back east. And so, we're talking about taking him about 30 miles. And they had to, there were no cars, no horse trailers, no rail spurs. They had to walk him to Dillon to get him on the train. He is shipped to Tennessee, put into race training, runs 5 times as 2-year-old, wins twice. And now the fun begins. In his 2-year-old year, there was a great Kentucky champion named after a famous Kentucky politician, at one time a governor. The horse was named Proctor Not. And Proctor Not was the champion 2-year-old. This was a painting made of one of the biggest races he won at Saratoga. Or not at Saratoga, I'm sorry, this is Sheep's Head Bay. This is still out in New York. The Sheep's Head Bay track doesn't exist anymore. So everybody was all about Proctor Not's the greatest horse that ever looked through a bridle. Nobody's going to beat him. Why, gosh, we hardly even need to run the Kentucky Derby because Proctor Not will, of course, win it. Spokane, in the meantime, had raced once as a 3-year-old. He finished second. He was running against older horses, but nobody was paying any attention. He only finished second. Proctor Not's the favorite. The best part, though, is if you take a look at what was going on, there were any number of signs that Spokane was made for greater things. First off, his jockey was a guy named Thomas Kiley. And Kiley was a little older, a little heavier, a little more experienced. Armstrong said he was the guy he brought in, when he had horses that had heavier handicaps. And back then, they rode a lot of kids as jockeys. I mean, you look at those. Nowadays, a Kentucky Derby horse carries 126 pounds. In those days, they actually handicapped the races, and the horses had different weights. Proctor Not had 115 pounds on him. Spokane had 118. The more weight on a horse, the better the horse is thought to be when the handicapper will give the better horse a higher, what we call an impost. At the time, the Derby was 1.5 miles. Today, it's 1.25 miles. And the best part is that when the horses went off, Spokane went off at 10-1. Proctor Not was the favorite at 3-1. It gets even better. Noah Armstrong was overheard saying, we couldn't possibly beat Proctor Not. Now, normally, the racehorse owners, they're all about, my horse is the best, you go, I'm going to win. No, Armstrong was like, no, I can't possibly defeat the great champion Proctor Not. And in fact, he was overheard telling Kiley, don't destroy my horse, I'll be happy if we finish second. And then Kiley gets a little messenger boy and says, go find my favorite bookie, put a bet on Proctor Not for me. Back in those days, the jockeys could bet on horses in a race they were riding. They can't do that anymore. And so all of a sudden, what's going to happen? Well, look at what happens to the odds. Proctor Not has more odds in his favor. The odds get longer on Spokane. And so, as the race begins, in those days, they had no starting gate. And Proctor Not, they have to just line up from a standing start, and then a flag would drop. Proctor Not was in a bad mood. He false started, he spun around, he was running frontwards, he was running backwards. They had to bring him back. They had a heck of a time getting a fair start on the race. But then when they finally did, he takes off like a shot. And everybody's like, yep, race is over, Proctor Not's ahead. Well, Kiley was smart. He just kept old Spokane right on the rail. And Spokane was a little lazy sometimes. Spokane was a closer. He always hung back at the start, and then he'd close at the finish, and that was when he'd speed up, is when he saw the home stretch. Well, as they're coming around the turn, Proctor Not just bolts for the outside rail. Some of the people today, that's where the concession stand is. They said he went for a hot dog. And his rider pulls him back, and they come thundering down the stretch, neck and neck. And everybody's like, Proctor Not's going to get up out front. Proctor Not's going to get up. Proctor Not is going to get out front. Spokane keeps his nose in front. And as he crosses the line, everybody's like, photo finish, except, oops, there's no photographs and photo finishes in 1889, so the judges confer. And the lead judge was none other than Colonel Meriwether Lewis Clark, Jr., grandson of William Clark, founder of Churchill Downs, creator of the Kentucky Derby, and the head judge. He was sitting in a chair. The judge's stand was right on the line, and he was just focused on that finish line. He had the best line of sight, and he said, Spokane won. They say a short head, a nose, but they said, he says, Spokane won it. And they made the results official. His time was 2 minutes, 34 and a half seconds. It was a Derby record. And because in 1896 they shortened the race to 1.25 miles, Spokane's record still stands for that 1.5 miles. So, immediately, we have a press feeding frenzy. First of all, how could the great Proctor Not be defeated? Oh my gosh, his jockey was terrible. The colonel was blind. Who knows what's going on? But everybody in Montana is thrilled. Everybody in Spokane, Washington is thrilled. The whole state of Illinois, because that is where Interpose was bred to Hyder Ali, they're all happy. He was trained in Tennessee. Everyone in Tennessee is thrilled. Really, the only people that aren't happy are the people in Kentucky. And so they decide that, the only way you're going to settle this question is it's got to be a fluke. So Spokane races again, not even quite a week later, in a race called the Clark Handicap, named after the good colonel himself. Well, this time it's settled. Spokane goes to the front and defeats Proctor Not one more time, this time by a very decisive 2 lengths, that's about 16 feet, 2 horse lengths, and the question is settled. Then we have the third race, about a month later, and this is the American Derby. And keep in mind when people say the Derby, there were many derbies. A derby is a race for 3-year-olds. The biggest of the 3 races at the time was the American Derby in Chicago. And in this race, the finish, he wins by a length. Proctor Not is way back, finishing last. And the best part of the American Derby is that the story takes the entire front page of the sports section. It wasn't the headlines on page 1, it was the page 1 of the sports news, but it took an entire page, spills over into page 2, goes into exhaustive detail about what the ladies were wearing, what the horses were doing, and a great deal of the story of Spokane comes out in this very, very long Chicago Tribune story that came out on June 23rd, 1889. One of the sketches shows Spokane being paraded in a blanket with many, many happy people throwing their hats in the air. And take a look at that blanket. This is from 1889, the newspaper, the famous blanket. Now, this was great because after he won the Derby, everybody in Spokane Falls was thrilled. And not only that, they knew a commercial opportunity for promotion when they saw it. And they said, let's start a subscription. Let's raise $500 and buy a really cool blanket, put his name on it. They raised $5,000. And this is, Spokane Falls, Washington Territory was still a pretty little town back then, so they did quite well. As you see, they made a very pretty blanket, lots of fancy embroidery, lots of gold and blue. By the way, these were Noah Armstrong's stable colors, were blue, and he called it dark gold. For some reason, the Jockey Club called them blue and orange, and I guess it's because they didn't recognize dark gold, so they called it orange. But these were his stable colors. And as you can see, it says Spokane, presented by the citizens of Spokane Falls, Washington Territory. This blanket was velvet. They held it on with this little gold surcingle. He has his hood. And these photographs come from the Riders Under the Big Sky exhibition that was in the 90s here at the Historical Society. This model horse of Spokane, this plaster model, he is in the possession of the Historical Society. We're going to talk about it. This blanket is owned by, I think it's owned by the city of Spokane, but it's on display. I think it's the Eastern Washington Museum of Art and Culture over there, and that's where that blanket is on display today. So they get it done between May 9th and, first, second week of June. They get it together pretty quick. They raise all this money, get this blanket made, and they had enough money left over that they could put several residents of Spokane on the train to Chicago, where they gave the blanket to Armstrong the day before the American Derby. Spokane puts it on. He's paraded out on the track with it before and after the race, and he wears that blanket at every other race from there on for the rest of his career. In the meantime, the Spokane residents, they all hit the track, and they had flyers. Come to Spokane Falls, business opportunities await. And they were handing out flyers up and down the stands to the thousands and thousands and thousands of people who turned out at Washington Park in Chicago for the American Derby. Pretty much everybody went home happy. Now, that was the peak of Spokane's career. After that, this was his last win, unfortunately. He ran again the next month, and that time Proctor Not finally got even and won. And since that time, the analysis is that the trainer, and possibly Armstrong was responsible, the trainer may have been responsible, we don't know. But they probably ran him more than they really should have, and he got tired and he just didn't do well the rest of the season. One of the stories about Spokane is that somebody said he was attacked by a stable hand. And what happened is that fall, he was sleeping in his stall one day when the stable hand probably wanted to clean the stall, and whether the guy was ignorant or whether he was mean and nasty, we don't know. But here's this horse laying down, snoozing in a stall, and the stable hand just takes his pitchfork and pokes him in the butt to make him get up. Well, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't react well to being poked by a pitchfork, and neither did Spokane, and he just leapt to his feet, and when he did it, he tore a tendon. And so he wasn't going to be able to race. He had a 9-month layoff. He had a lot of lameness issues. He picked up pneumonia at one point. And they basically brought him back to the track about 9 months later. They put him in a couple of races in June and early July. He actually ran him 4 times, and he finished second twice, but it was clear that he wasn't his old self, and they retired him as a 4-year-old. His record, he ran 17 races, won 5, second in 4, and third in 2. So it was a very respectable record. He did just fine. This is the only color image we have of Spokane, showing that, yes, he was a chestnut. He's got a red mane and tail. He's a brown horse. He's got his nice little short blaze. He's got 2 white hind legs. And this is the jockey's silks. This is, again, the blue jacket, dark gold sleeves. Unfortunately, the artist was a guy named Henry Stull. And Henry Stull, bless his heart, he painted a lot of racehorses. And what he did is he drew a horse and put the markings on right. As you can tell, this painting kind of defies the laws of physics. I don't know, I've never seen a person's toes that long. The horse, he kind of isn't in proportion to himself. Stull was not the world's greatest horse artist, and there's all sorts of his work all over the place. And every time I see a horse picture he's painted, I kind of shake my head a little bit. But anyway, this was, that's supposed to be how Spokane looked in his prime, only a little bit better. Now, he was retired, and he never did return to Montana. There's stories that he came back to Montana in triumph where he was greeted by a brass band. No, that didn't happen. He did stand at stud in several different stud farms. One of them was Elmendorf Farm, which I've got a picture of here. At the time he was at Elmendorf, it was owned by somebody else. It later became very famous because it was purchased by one of the investors in the Anaconda Copper Company, a guy by the name of James Ben Ali Hagen, who was a big thoroughbred breeder, as well as one of the co-owners with Marcus Daly of the Anaconda Copper Company. He stood at stud until at least through the 1897 season. Some people say he had fertility problems. He may have just not been real popular, because even today, if you have an unstylish horse standing in Kentucky, the Kentucky people go, "Oh, really?" And they don't send mares to these horses. He does have at least 9 or 10 recorded offspring, and he had a daughter named Spirituelle, who was a stakes winner, and she herself went on to have foals. I was tracing Spokane descendants. His line appears to have died out about in the 1950s, but he probably was also crossed on a lot of local mares, horses of just, the farm horses, the riding horses, the saddle horses. There are probably descendants of Spokane alive today, although I haven't found any recorded thoroughbreds. The sad thing is that we know the last time anybody mentioned him was when he was auctioned on November 28th, 1898. And by this time, he's lame, he's getting on in years, and he sells for $170. The newspapers reported on it because it was sort of a big deal that a Kentucky Derby winner sold for such a low price. And it's not clear if Armstrong owned him by that time. It is likely that Armstrong sold his interest to one of these stud farms where he stood at some point in time, but we don't have a clear record. Armstrong himself in the 1890s had sold all of his Montana properties, and he ultimately moved to Seattle, which is where he lived out the rest of his life. Spokane disappears from the historic record after this sale, so we don't know what really happened to him. But it was interesting because his buyers were these gentlemen, W.H. May and Sons, who did own and raise racehorses. So, what happened to Spokane? Well, a few things we know for sure. He was not killed by an enraged stable hand. That was one of them. There was also a story that a jockey had fallen off and he had fallen and Armstrong retired Spokane because of the tragic death of the jockey. That didn't happen. As far as we know, he didn't return to Montana. My favorite was in the Spokane Chamber of Commerce newsletter about 20 years ago. They claimed that he was made into a taxidermy mount, and that was the horse that was in the carriage house at the governor's mansion. Yeah, it's in writing. They really said that. That was my favorite. And then there is the plaster horse who does exist here at the Historical Society. There's a claim that his tail hair is really from Spokane, except Spokane was a chestnut and the tail hair is black, so no, Spokane was not a bay. So, and furthermore, nobody knows what happened to his tail, so I'm pretty sure that our model horse here at the Society is not, does not have Spokane's real tail hair. And I know that's kind of a bummer to some of the folks here, but unfortunately, I think I can disprove that. So, where did all these myths come from? As I was working on my book, I would keep coming across wonderful stories, and I would say, you can't make this stuff up. Well, somebody did. And the people who did were a gentleman named Howard Wade, who wrote for a tabloid called the National Police Gazette. It took me probably a half hour of Googling for this PowerPoint to find the most family-friendly cover of the National Police Gazette that I could find. I'm not kidding you. This is, you know, the not safe for work covers of this thing. It published into the 60s, and there were covers that make some of the tabloids we see at our supermarket chick stands today look like, you know, Pulitzer Prize winning responsible journalism. The Police Gazette started out as kind of like a true crime, true detective type of magazine. Evolved very quickly into what's obviously what it was. I, like the Daily Racing Form, explained it that it was a tabloid not renowned for the accuracy of its sources. And so they told, that's where the cougar attacking Spokane story came from. The interposed ran with the wild Mustangs part of the story. The wild outlaw colt took 6 men to break him. All of that came from this one tabloid story in 1951. They must have had filler, apparently, like other magazines we know. They must have thought some people would read the National Police Gazette for the articles. So they needed content, and they didn't really pay too much attention to where it came from. So that's where the myths of Spokane largely arrived. As for the rest of the story, we don't know what happened to Spokane. There are a number of legends that he came back to Montana. We know he did not come back to Twin Bridges to be greeted by a brass band because, for one thing, we know he stayed in Kentucky until at least 1898. There is an interesting theory, and Susan Nardinger mentioned this to me when I interviewed her. She said, could May have been a buyer's agent for Marcus Daly? Marcus Daly bought Hyder Ali. Hyder Ali died in 1895, so Marcus Daly may have wanted to get himself a very nice champion stallion. He also, if you look at the race results from Daly's Butte and Anaconda tracks for 1898, W.H. May and Sons nominated horses for the stakes races in Butte and Anaconda. They were shipping horses out here on trains all the time. Marcus Daly himself had a couple of rail cars that he used just to ship his own horses back and forth from Hamilton to the tracks on the East Coast. So, is it possible that May had picked up Spokane for Daly and they popped him on a train to bring him back to Montana? We don't know. We cannot prove this. But what's interesting is there's a couple of stories about the fate of Spokane, one of which is that he got sick on the train and was stopped in Miles City and taken off the train. And in one story, you know, the young boy who loved the old horse nursed him back to health. And in another one, he got sick and he died. But we've got two different stories about a train in Miles City where Spokane was taken off. So we don't know. But it is interesting that it's not impossible somebody tried to bring him back home. Now, for the rest of the story, no, Spokane was not made into a taxidermy mount, but TC Power of our Power Townsend Company did commission a full-size plaster of Paris, kind of a papier-mâché model horse, to be painted to look like Spokane. White legs. I've got a selfie. I found him. There he is. Blaze on his face. And he displayed him at the old Power Townsend store, which was originally downtown in the Steamboat Block. This photograph is from the 1938 Vigilante Parade, where, you know, the kids have been doing that for a while. The float won the sweepstakes award, and they, brought out the horse, put a kid on him in a racing saddle, jockey silks, the whole 9 yards. After that, the Spokane model was actually taken over to the carriage house at the original governor's mansion, and they put harness on him and used him to model harness for quite a few years while they had the carriages over there in the carriage house. And as we saw in the earlier slide, he got brought out again in the 90s to model Spokane's blanket. And when I found him, I felt like I was Indiana Jones at the conclusion of Raiders of the Lost Ark, you know, where they take the Lost Ark and they put it into the warehouse at the Smithsonian. He's tucked away. He's very safe. So we don't have to worry about the fate of our plaster model Spokane. But no, I can guarantee you he is not a taxidermy mount. There's one other horse, and he too is painted to look a little bit like Spokane. He's got the little triangular blaze on his face, except he's kind of the wrong color. He's got a black mane and tail, and they painted his feet. They painted his front feet white instead of painting his back feet white. But this is, a lot of people look at him and say he was painted. Somebody wanted him to look like Spokane. He probably was also manufactured by the Toledo Display Horse Company. Kent DeVore thought that it was probably around 1900 this model was created. He got it for DeVore's Saddlery in 1951. When DeVore's closed, we have Toby over at Bert and Ernie's got a hold of him and towed him across the street. And here he is today carrying Ernie. So that is the rest of the story of Spokane, and he is loved and remembered by everyone in Montana. And at this point in time, I'll open things up for questions. We can maybe bring up the lights, and I'm encouraging everybody. I am writing a book that is coming out in July. I have an entire chapter about Spokane where you can learn even more than what I told you today. And so if you do want to reserve a copy, I've got some forms over here on the table, and we can go ahead and pass them around. And if you want to, they tell you to write checks. Please don't. No money now. Just put your name and contact information on the forms, and we can collect them, and we'll give them to the folks at the bookstore. So at this point, are there any questions that I can answer? Yes?
Might have missed it, but where south of Spokane is the horse slaughter camp?
It's actually by Liberty Lake. It's along Interstate 90.
Oh, north.
Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. I have to repeat the question. The question is, where was the horse slaughter camp? And it was real close to Liberty Lake, Washington. It's, if you know where the Spokane River Centennial Trail is, there's apparently a little historic marker at about mile marker 2. So it's actually just over the Idaho line.
Do you still see the bones?
No, they finally have, they finally have gone back to the earth. But, and I think, there's a lot of development in that area now, but I think there is a historical marker along the trail that says that this was roughly where it was at. So, yes.
What about the wooden mosaic on the barroom floor?
Ah, the wooden mosaic on the barroom floor of Anaconda. That is a great question. That is Tammany. That is Marcus Daly's champion, Tammany, who won some major races in 1893 and 1894. And I also got some pictures of that mosaic. They're going to be in the book too. It's going to be great. That mosaic was saved by the Daly estate when they kind of tore up the Anaconda Hotel, or the Montana Hotel in Anaconda in the, when was it? It was in the 70s or the 80s. They managed to get that mosaic up off the floor, and it's in storage at the Daly Mansion over in Hamilton. So that's where that's at. In Hamilton, yeah. It's at the Marcus Daly Mansion.
Well, I went there St. Patrick's Day last year, and they said it was saved, but it was in Seattle.
It's up on the 3rd floor in an obscure back room, and and we found it. We eased it out into the hall, and I probably took about 50 pictures of it trying to get the light right. So it is in the book, yes. Yes, and I also have some full color pictures of it too. So I think they may have posted a picture, one of the pictures I took of it on the Facebook page of the Society a few months back. So you might want to flip through the Facebook feed and see if we can find it again. Yes?
I'm very impressed, Brenda. So tell me, how long have you been researching this?
How long have I been researching this? Well, on one way you can look at it is when I got my Shetland pony when I was 8. I got serious about this book probably September, October 2017. Actually, what got me going on the racehorse thing, if anybody remembers a few years ago, there was a racehorse named California Chrome. And I just became a lot more interested in the history of horse racing. I'd always kind of followed horses, but I think Chrome really got me excited about getting into it in a lot more depth. Yes, in the back.
In your new book, or in the one that you have out, are you going to focus on any of the horse racing history here in Helena, like the Proctor Not?
The history of horse racing in the Helena area, I focus a lot on the track at the fairgrounds and some of the early races. I don't have anything on the Kleffner Ranch. Actually, that's something that I'd love to learn more about. The horse racing at the Kleffner Ranch would be really fun to look into, and I'd love to learn a little more about that. I do have a whole chapter on Helena. I talk about Madam Cody's fashion course, which we still haven't found it, but it's somewhere out either by Spring Meadow Lake or the Archie Bray. It's on one side of 10 Mile Creek or the other. We just have to find 40 acres that were relatively flat. And then they started racing there in 1868. And then they built the fairgrounds track in 1870. And so I have quite a bit of history on that. And so that was where my focus was. Yes?
Have you done any research on in the Missoula area?
Yes.
Western Montana?
Missoula area, western Montana, absolutely.
1900s?
I do. I have a chapter on Missoula, and so that's how actually that's how we got these silks. Was when I was researching Missoula, I got a hold of Tony Hinton at the Western Montana Turf Club, and they helped me get started. I also did some research at the library over there. Yes, there's some wonderful works. Kim Brigham at the Missoulian was absolutely invaluable and helped me find a lot of information. They had 3 different tracks over there over the years. It's really interesting, yes. So, yes.
Was there any sulky racing?
Any sulky racing? Yes. Harness racing in Montana it's kind of like the difference between the harness racing and the running racing. It's sort of like NASCAR and Formula One. And harness racing was very popular throughout Montana, really until about the early 1900s. It's sort of as the automobile began to replace the horse, harness racing kind of faded, and you started to see car racing on these racetracks, much to the chagrin of the horse people because they kind of messed it up. But so yes, harness racing up to until about 1900 was more popular than running races.
Is there anything on harness racing in your book?
Yes, there will be some things on harness racing in the book. Especially we talk about people like Raymond, we talk about him a little bit. I will admit I don't cover the harness racing as thoroughly as I cover the running races, but we talk about it some.
The one down in
Yes, we talk about the Beaumont down in Belgrade. Any other questions? Yes?
Was horse racing Western Montana thing, or do you cover some of
Statewide, statewide. Horse racing ran across Montana. We've had race meets in Baker. We had race meets in Glendive, Sydney, Glasgow, all through eastern Montana. And we had tracks as well as Hamilton, Missoula, Kalispell, and there were county fair. I mean, every county fair, when you had somebody say, let's build a fairgrounds, they put in, they hooked up a plow and they graded a racetrack before they put up the exhibit buildings. That was the way, that was what county fairs used to be. They were inseparable from horse racing. And so, yeah, there's quite a bit. I interviewed one fellow who said they had, Lincoln County, up in northwestern Montana, they had races. I found records of races down in Victor and Darby, Stevensville, and one of the earliest records of a horse race, in fact, was at Fort Union, which, of course, if you've ever been up to far northeastern Montana, Fort Union, the parking lot's on the Montana side of the line, and the buildings, the administration's on the North Dakota side of the line, so they tell you it's in North Dakota, but they had a story that John James Audubon came out there to visit Alexander Culbertson and his wife, who was Natavistic Sina, who was a Blackfeet. She was Kenai. Is that the way to say that, Kenai? Who's a Blackfeet person in here? Not Kootenai. It's the what we call they used to call them the Blood Tribe, the Blackfoot Confederacy up in Canada. Anyway, Culbertson's wife was a member of the Blackfoot Nation, and the two of them staged some horse races to entertain Audubon when he was out there, and they just went racing back and forth across the prairie, and I'm going to maintain stoutly that they probably ran from east to west, and I'm betting that was one of the earlier horse races in Montana. So out there in the far northwest, or northeast. Yes?
I see you have a picture on your cover of the Native American, and I can't remember what they're called, but you must are covering that too.
Yes, on the book on the picture down here, this is of Indian Relay. That's what that photograph is. And Indian Relay it's really becoming a thing. Some people are familiar that there was a documentary done on PBS that aired a while back. You can still stream it if you go out to places where you can stream video. And when I was doing my research, I got up to North American Indian Days in Browning. I didn't get to Crow Fair last year. I'm hoping I can get down there. But there's Indian Relay meets now running in a number of county fair tracks all over the state. They had one up in Dodson, up in Phillips County, where there was a track already. Any of these old county fair half-mile ovals that they can still have most of the oval and they can renovate them and work up the dirt, they can host Indian Relays, and especially in eastern Montana, they're doing it. It's keeping a lot of these old tracks alive. Billings hosted the National Indian Relay Championships about 4 or 5 years ago. So, any other questions? I think we're about out of time, so I'll stay around for a bit if anybody wants to talk afterwards, but thank you all for coming, and I appreciate you've been a great audience.